Yes, my name is Tamara. I work here overseeing the volunteers and the programs, but previously my job per trade was an environmental educator. So I will be upfront, I am not a geologist. I know a bit about geology. I love learning about geology and how things formed, but I would say I'm more of a storyteller. So at the end, I'm sure somebody's going to ask a geology question that I don't know, but I will try my best. So I'm not originally from this area. I am from central New York near Syracuse and Utica. I moved to this area to work at a state park near Albany, Grafton Lake State Park. And that was really my first experience with the Hudson River, other than just coming and visiting this area. And when I met my husband, he said, oh, let's go kayaking. And I was like, oh, that sounds amazing. Like, I could just go kayaking in my backyard, the Hudson River. But he grew up here. You know, that to him it's fun. But it's something that, you know, as somebody who grew up with the Hudson River in their backyard, he kind of takes it for granted, whereas I'm like, this is amazing. So it really made me wonder, like, okay, how was this thing formed? Like, it's so vast of a formation, the Hudson River, and depending on where you are, it's very wide, very skinny, very deep, very shallow. So many, many things going on depending on where in the Hudson River you are. So, for example, I will be running the half marathon up Breakneck Mountain in just a few weeks. If anyone has been down there in Beacon, you know very well how steep that mountain is. You can see right there in the center, you're very close to the water's edge, and then it goes straight up the mountain, which is not something that we have here by Poughkeepsie. We do have, you know, some hills. The walkway was purposely built here as a higher area, but we don't have anything like this. So why does this exist where it exists? That's one question for us. And along that, you can see the width of the Hudson River in this area is about 3,000 feet. So it's not that wide, relatively skinny. Just south of that, in Highland Falls, is a mere 1,772 feet. So one of the skinniest parts of the Hudson River just below that. Way skinnier than where we are currently. So what's going on? Why is it skinnier there versus here? And why is this part of the Hudson River by the Cuomo Bridge so wide? Over 14,000 feet. So we're talking just north of it, less than 2,000 feet in Highland Falls, and then down here, almost 15,000 feet. So there's things happening here that is affecting how wide, how skinny, how deep the Hudson River. So all these questions, why? As compared to this area, so all of those areas had more mountainous, high, steep cliffs. Closer to where I live, up in Athens, New York, it's very gentle rolling hills. You don't have any of those steep sides. It's only about 30 feet deep in that area. So something is going on underneath the surface that is causing these dramatic changes depending on where you are in the Hudson River. And it creates all these different beautiful views depending where you are. So to give you an overview of the Hudson River, it is over 300 miles long. It is an extremely long river, stretching all the way from the Adirondacks down to New York City, down to the ocean, basically. And it starts at Lake Tier of the Clouds. It is a several mile hike to get to this lake if you ever want to go. Not very large, pretty small, as the Hudson River does start basically as a small stream and then widens once you get down to like Glens Falls in that area. So you can see where we are, it's the southern part of New York State, but still quite a ways of the Hudson River below us. So to understand all of the things that went into forming the Hudson River, we actually have to go back over 1 billion years. So we're going to talk about the foundation that had to be laid in order for the Hudson River to form. We're then going to talk about the glaciers that actually did the carving. And along that, the glacial Lake Albany that continued that sculpting, and then go into present day, how that affects us today. So why did the Hudson River form where it did? So I really love being a volunteer coordinator. I get to interact with so many different people who are specifically here because they love volunteering. They love the walkway. And all of these red vests you see in the crowd, those are all ambassadors. So most of the ambassadors are retired age, and so they have a lot of knowledge that goes back decades and decades. And they love to tell me stories of those who grew up in this area, how when the train would go by that used to go across this bridge here, if there was laundry out, they had to put it inside because the soot would get all over the laundry. And so stories like this is so incredible of the people that have memories that go back 60, 70, 80 years. But if we want to understand things that go back before people are living, we have written texts that go back thousands of years. We have, pictures on the walls in caves that go back tens of thousands of years. But what if we want to understand going back farther than that, way before humans were ever around? Well, then we need to tap into Mother Nature's memories. So let's talk rocks. So this is a map of the geology and the rocks of New York State. You can see it's very complicated and complex. There's a lot going on, a lot of history over billions of years that contributed to the rocks that we have today. So let's zoom in a little bit. So we are there, and still pretty complicated, so I'm not going to go too much in depth of what this all is. Like I said, I'm not a geologist. But let's start to look at like a pattern that we're seeing of how and where the Hudson River is. So if we look up, we can see there's a lot of blue on the left, and then we've got some brown, some yellow, and then like a darker blue. And it cuts down pretty straight in that area. Oh, it doesn't work on the TV. And then where we are, you can see on the west side is one color, and on the east side is a completely different color. Go down farther than that. You have green on one side, and you have several other shades on the other side. So this is giving you a clue already of why the Hudson River cut through this area. Because quite often, when I was first doing my research trying to understand this geology, it's like, oh, the Hudson River was cut by the glaciers. I'm like, well, yeah, but why was it cut where it was cut? So this is our first clue of that. But let's simplify it a little bit for layman's terms and understand why Breakneck Ridge is cut the way it's cut. So this, we're going to look at our handout here. So you can pull out your handout. So you can see in this handout, the section that we are currently zoomed in on is that orange middle section. That is Breakneck Ridge, and that is our Precambrian rock. Precambrian means really old, really old. More than 1 billion years old rock. So in that time, lots of things happen. And what's really interesting about Precambrian rock, quite often, it is a type of rock that I'm sure many of you are familiar with back from grade school. It is metamorphic rock. So it is, of the three types, we have metamorphic, igneous, and sedimentary. Igneous being volcanic, sedimentary being sediments. Metamorphic, think butterfly. metamorphosis, change. So it started as one thing, and over time, through what we call orogenies, or mountain building events, they were compressed and squeezed to make it a harder rock. And a billion-year-old rock has had many mountain building events to make it harder and harder. So in this area, part of the reason why this rock is so resistant to erosion is because of how hard of a rock it is. So you can see just north of it in your picture, you can see how it's wider in that like brown area, the river itself. And then it gets really skinny down in this area here. And then it opens up below that. So if we go to what did the Precambrian Earth look like, right? So we want to tap into the memories of Mother Nature. So Precambrian Earth was barren. There was very little life at all on Earth a billion years ago. If you were to be standing on land, you wouldn't see any greenery. You wouldn't see any beautiful colors of flowers and things of the sort. In fact, you really wouldn't see any life on land. You'd see like bare rocks. And then even below the surface, you would really only see like single-celled organisms, and maybe as we get close to a billion years ago, you'd have like algae. So it's a very quiet time in the Earth's history. So specifically, the types of rock that we have on the second, it's actually the third page, or the back of the second page, we have number 40 and 41 is the type of rock for that area in the Hudson Highlands. Basically, all of that is characteristic of the Hudson Highlands, and the reason why we have those Hudson Highlands is this metamorphic rock, which is mostly granite and gneiss. So that G is silent. It's not gneiss or gneiss, it's gneiss. Gotta love English and literary. All right, so let's fast forward. We're going down, gonna keep going down south. So you can see I just basically moved the map up a little bit. Now we're looking at the second part. You can see that it goes from pretty skinny to very wide. In fact, that's where that Cuomo Bridge is located, where the width of the ocean, or sorry, the width of the river is almost 15,000 feet. So we're going from about 2,000 feet in the Hudson Highlands, very narrow, very jagged, high cliffs, to very wide, vast. So the Cambrian era, you have what is known as the Cambrian explosion. So if you could compare the life before the Cambrian era to the life after the Cambrian era, again, we said before it's pretty quiet, not much multicellular life. It would be like if you were to whisper to a friend. That's the Precambrian, like that amount of like life happening, to attending a rock concert. That's the amount of life that suddenly formed during the Cambrian era. In fact, during this era, eyes formed, teeth formed, exoskeletons, all of these things evolved, leading to the first predators. So I'm going to try to pronounce this. Anomalocaris is that sea predator there. You can't see, but kind of in between its eyes, underneath its body, is where its mouth is. It did have some serrated teeth that it would use to hunt, different animals and things that were in the ocean. And so still at this time, you didn't have much life out of the ocean. So still, if you were on land, you might think, oh, it's still pretty quiet. But not so if you're underneath the water. Very, very different during the Cambrian era under the water. And so I'm just going to go back here. In here, if you were to assume again, for that wide area, that most of that rock is a softer rock, and that's why it was able to channel and create such a bigger channel. You would be partially correct. So the Cambrian rock, which is mostly sedimentary rock, is over on the left. That is in the brown there. That is number 20. So if you flip to your to the second page there, you can look at 20 as sedimentary rock. I believe it's dolomite and a couple other types. Versus actually on the east shore, you do also have igneous rock and metamorphic rock. So what contributed to this widening so much in this area is mostly the sedimentary Cambrian rock on the west shore. But something else was happening. So we're like, okay, I understand the sedimentary rock, but that's dramatic, going from really, really skinny to really, really wide. Something else was happening. So in that area, there is the Ramapo Fault. This fault was formed during the tectonic orogeny, which was about 450 million years ago. So faults are formed when mountains are colliding. And down, pointing out the Mario Cuomo Bridge, that bridge is about 3 miles wide. Very long bridge. Thank goodness the Mid-Hudson Bridge is not that long, does not take that long to cross. But as a result, this is what Earth would have looked like back then. So I actually want you to close your eyes and pretend that you are looking east. So today, if you were looking east, you would see Poughkeepsie, but you don't see Poughkeepsie. In fact, what you see is an ancient volcanic arc. And this ancient volcanic arc is spewing lava. And you know that not because of your eyes, but because of your nose. You can smell the sulfur from here of how big those volcanoes were at that time. All right, you can open your eyes back up. So what was going on? How do we have volcanoes back then? The plates were shifting, and the oceanic plate was moving towards North America and actually riding over it. So the North American plate was what we call subducting. Think of submarine. It was going underneath the Baltica plate, the oceanic plate. And as that's happening, you have this crust that originally had land on it. Now you have this really hot molten core that is melting that crust, and it's causing bubbles and lava and magma to rise up and basically burst through the crust, creating our volcanoes. And these volcanoes, again, we're talking millions and millions of years of things to form, things to move. And so over time, these kept getting closer and closer to what at the time was North America. And when those collided, you got squishing. You got metamorphic rock forming over that time, and then it kept moving. In fact, you can see behind it is an ocean, and behind that is more land. So eventually, that ocean, you can think of like a pre-Atlantic ocean, did close. And so that pushed all that land up against, and again, creating these different types of metamorphic rock. And specifically, when that happened, it was so much pressure, so much compression and heat that it actually ripped rocks apart, the bedrock apart in the form of a fault. And so much so it dragged the rock that was really, basically here, dragged it, shoved it on top, and then on top of the younger rock. So normally, you'd have young rock here and old rock here because it got covered by rock over time. But in these areas, we have a lot of exposure of old rock because this rock got shoved up on top of younger rock. And then some of those younger layers on top of that did erode over time. So in just north of that fault has all exposed Precambrian rock. Just north or south of that, you have younger rock. So that's that fault causing a weakness in the rock. So as the Hudson River was forming, you had this fault here that caused a weakness and caused the area below that to be able to be eroded more easily. So in summary, the foundation that set the stage for our next step is that there were rock boundaries. You had two different types of rock being next to each other that we pointed out on the two different sides of the Hudson River. You had different types of rock, so very old hard rock, metamorphic rock versus much younger sedimentary rock. And then you also had faults. So all three of these things were pivotal over 1 billion years of Earth's history in order to fast forward almost to present day in geologic terms to the Ice Age. So the last glacial maximum was about 20,000 years ago. And at this time, you had some different life on Earth. You had woolly mammoths. You had saber-toothed cats. Those are one of my favorites. And you had giant sloths. And you did have early modern humans. So that's what we see here. And you can imagine that it was much colder in that time. Overall, across the world, there's about a 6-degree difference in climate and about a 46-degree average temperature. Now, that's average for the entire world. So obviously, some areas much colder, some areas much warmer. So 6 degrees doesn't sound very much, but that allowed an ice age to happen. So that's, gives you a clue of how, how important it is to maintain our climate. And so how much ice covered this area? About 1.5 miles of ice covered this area. Now that's kind of hard to imagine. How much is 1.5 miles? So in this image here, we have the Empire State Building. And the Empire State Building, you can see, would fit maybe like 7 times in the Laurenta ice sheet that covered this area. And that's a pretty big building. That's almost 15,000 or almost 1,500 feet tall building because the ice in this area was almost 8,000 feet. And one of the things I like to say, because sometimes even that picture is hard to understand, just the vastness, the weight of the ice in this area. So who's heard of the dire wolves that are recently brought back? Okay, so dire wolves were existent during this area. So I do have my little wolf here. So we're going to pretend my little wolf is a human, and it's about 1 3/4 inch, pretty small. So if I were to put this down in Upper Landing Park on the other side of the river and be looking up at the walkway, which is about 200 feet above your head, 212 for my ambassadors, you would be, and I would put this on the ground, that being the human, the walkway would be the ice, would be the glacier. So a lot of ice. So here's an image of how much the Laurentide ice sheet covered North America. Basically covered the majority of New York State, but really didn't cover much farther below it. So we'll talk about, what does that mean? So evidence of glaciers today. We have glacial striations, which is what we see here in this image. It's basically, when the glaciers would come and be growing, they'd be moving in a way, they would be picking up lots of pebbles and lots of, sometimes much bigger than pebbles. We'll get to what erratics are. But they'd be picking up lots of pebbles. And so as they moved, those pebbles would like scratch lines into rocks. So you can actually see evidence of, these memories of glaciers long ago. Glacial erratics. Has anyone ever seen like a gigantic boulder at the top of a mountain? It's like, how did it get there? Aliens. Well, actually it was glaciers. These glaciers, again, huge, would pick up entire boulders. And then as they receded, as they melted, they would drop them in new areas. And then finally we have moraines. And moraine is mostly when a glacier stops. Again, think of this like really bulldozing effect. That this heavy, heavy ice sheet is moving, and it's moving all the sediment down. And it's causing these, wherever it stops is where all that sediment stops. So in this image here, call all the sediment and stuff freeloaders, getting a ride on the glacier. Bulldozed sediment, internal load there, flowing of ice. Again, this is very slow movement, but you can think of it like flowing. And you're getting that pile of sediment at the end. Terminus meaning, the end. And here, so this is down near New York City, you have all of these terminal moraines. All these piles of sediment that built up at the bottom of where the glaciers stretch to. And so there's evidence of that just, down near New York City. And so in this area specifically, we already talked about the fact that you had two different types of rocks on what would become the Hudson River. So that's a weak point. So as this huge glacier is bulldozing, it's going to end up bulldozing even more in that weak point. So keep that in mind, that not only is it just scraping off the top in general, wherever it's going, but it's also really causing more of like a trough in those areas where those two types of rock, whatever two types of rock they are meeting. And, a mile and a half of ice is very heavy. So what would happen is it would actually compress the earth, and compress the earth's crust, I should say. So those natural rock boundaries created natural low areas. I was a little ahead of myself, I guess. And so as the water melted, as the glacier receded, that water would start to fill in that low area. And you can imagine that much ice, as it melts, creates a really big lake. So before there was the Hudson River, there was Glacial Lake Albany. This lake stretched from Glens Falls to Poughkeepsie, and it was pretty massive. You can see it actually a stream of it stretched all the way to New York City, and then it, filtered out to the ocean, but the majority of the lake, what we think of like similar to Lake George, that stretched from Glens Falls to Poughkeepsie. And here's a little diagram of the dam that kept this lake in. So basically, as the glacier was melting, all of the sediment from the moraines was down at the bottom of New York State. And so this lake was kept in by basically that natural dam. Sometimes from glaciers, that dam can be sediment. Sometimes it's ice. Just depends. Generally, there is no engineer checking everything with these dams. And they tend to be structurally unsound. Now imagine if a dam that's holding back that much water were to break. I'm going to skip this one for now, and I'll go back to it. So about 13,000 years ago, the dam broke. Catastrophic floods, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of gallons, all released at one time. So not only do we have the glaciers causing this, scouring of the earth in these low areas that were caused by these natural boundaries between rocks, but now we've got torrent of water coming down, causing even more scouring, causing the depth of some areas of the Hudson to be almost or over 200 feet deep. And so just to skip back here, at this time, the level of the ocean was much lower. You can imagine if you have gigantic ice sheets, a lot of the water for the earth is trapped in those ice sheets. So the shoreline, you can see the outline of Long Island. The shoreline was way, way out. It was 400 feet lower than it is today, the ocean level. And as a result, where basically the boundary of land was at that time was the continental shelf, which makes a little bit more sense of why is the continental shelf way out there now? As those glaciers started to melt, you had all of that water had to go somewhere, so it filled in the oceans. So what originally was all this freshwater lake, and now, but also very low in level, the water rises very quickly, causes intrusion of the salt. So today we know that as an estuary. So we have generally saltwater intrusion goes as far north as Beacon. It can come as far north as Poughkeepsie. Very, very rarely does it go farther north than that. In fact, in times when it does come as far north as Poughkeepsie, then Poughkeepsie has to rely on Hudson in order to supply their fresh water. So when the glacial Lake Albany drained, it continued to affect the lowness of the land. The glaciers eventually melt, the sea level rises, and we get what's called a drowned river. So a drowned river is you already have a river, but then the sea level rises so quickly that it pushes the salt water into that river, and you get a mixing or brackish water or an estuary. So it's drowned river kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but that's where that term comes from. And what also is evidence of this today is our tides. So, and we'll get to that, how that affects everything. But next. Did I go too? Okay. So now talking about much, much closer in time frame. So when I first became the volunteer services manager, I was told that, and when I moved here in this area in general, that there are something called tides in a river. What? Very odd to me, because all the rivers in central New York do not have tides. You do not have to worry about taking your kayak out in one direction and fighting the tide to get back. So obviously, Native Americans have lived in this area for very long, and they actually named the Hudson River based on the fact that it's a river that flows both ways. I can attempt Mahicantuck, I think is how I looked it up. Mahicantuck is what the Native Americans originally referred to this lake to the Hudson River as. And so here's an image of Upper Landing. This is at high tide. I do apologize. I could not find an image at low tide. But I've been there when it's low tide, and basically you can see all the rocks at the bottom of that little inlet there. So here, it's at least a few feet deep, or at least a foot or two. And compared to low tide, it's down and it's trickling over. So very cool to see from the walkway, looking down. You can tell when all the water is rushing out, because the water actually looks black, but it's just cold, fresh water intruding into the Hudson River water. So it's not black, it's just because it's cold. Yes?
There's a large sandbar that forms right out.
Yes.
That.
Yes.
You can also tell the tides by that sandbar.
Yes, exactly. And that actually, I didn't throw it in here, but that actually reminds me, so anytime that there is a sandbar near a bridge, that is due to the pylons of a bridge. So the pylons of the bridge actually affect the sediment as it's flowing down the river. And so there's an image that I could possibly pull up a little bit later that basically you can see the lines of sediment that are caused by the pylons in the river. And right here in Poughkeepsie, you have like a huge one just south of the mid-Hudson River. What else can we tell from evidence of glaciers? Well, we have a lot of clay. How's clay formed? So as the glaciers are moving, they're picking up all of that sediment, and they're like squishing it and grinding it and compressing it until you get really, really, really fine sediment. For example, the size difference between a clay particle and a sand particle is like the size difference between a marble and a basketball. So clay particles are really, really tiny, and they hold water very well. That's why they're used to make bricks, because they basically cement together, and then when fired for a week under high temperatures, become very solid, very durable things to use to build items, such as, this is an example of a brickyard that was in operation for about 150 years, over 150 years, just south of here in Haverstraw. So the Haverstraw brickyard, they would lay out all of the molded bricks to dry. Then they would fire them in a kiln, like I said, for a week. And the bricks that came out of the Haverstraw brickyard were used in things such as the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building. So without the glaciers, without the time before the glaciers that made the sedimentary rock that eventually the glaciers picked up and ground down into clay, you wouldn't have some of our beautiful, beautiful structures in New York City. Finally, because I work for the Walkway, I have to tie it back to that. So obviously, the Walkway is here because the Hudson is here. So in 1889, the Walkway, the Poughkeepsie Highland Railroad Bridge was opened, and it was the only bridge between Albany and New York City. So it was the only way to get across, whether it be passenger or freight or circus performers or mail. So lots of reasons to get across using this bridge back then. In fact, up to 3,500 cars crossed over the bridge a day in its heyday. And it was active until 1974, when a very bad fire did end the time of the Poughkeepsie Highland Railroad Bridge. It became a community effort in the 1990s to save the bridge from demolition. 1990s, 2009, that's a lot of time that people from this community, such as Fred Schaefer and Bill Seppi, spent dedicated to trying to save this and created a pedestrian walkway. Opened in 2009. Originally, I've heard, again, I love the memories of my volunteers. No real bathrooms, no park visitor center, no stores, things like. over time, through the Friends of the Walkway and the park, now we have all these beautiful facilities. And today we also boast over 150 volunteers. We boast our events, and we are growing, as Shirley said in the beginning, we are growing our programs. So, do you have any questions?
A non-geologist.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a storyteller, and if you have a geology question, I'll try to answer it.
I was just wondering where the salt comes from. Is it coming from the glaciers, coming from the rocks, or is it a combination of different things?
Like the salt deposits.
Yeah, the salt, how the Hudson River became salty.
I mean, like I would assume certainly some of that is, from the saltwater intrusion from the ocean. Yeah, yep. So, previously stated, quite often it comes as far north as Beacon. So I actually would love to do like a taste test of like Albany versus Poughkeepsie versus Beacon versus New York City water. I'm sure down towards New York City, much saltier, but it would be cool. Especially during times of drought, the saltwater intrusion can come farther north, and then you might have a difference in taste of Hudson water out here in Poughkeepsie.
Well, I remember I'm going to say, at least 12, maybe 15 years ago, we did have that odd condition up by in the Sophis, and the blue crabs came all the way up there, and it was a huge blue crab fest. I mean, everybody was on the river because those were edible, and we ate them, a lot of them.
Yes, I actually had a blue crab for the first time a couple years back in Cape Cod. Blue crab also got my finger at one point. Was not very happy with that. Felt a little, like got it back when I cooked it. But yes. It's very interesting because blue crab are in the Hudson River, but yes, mostly down farther south, but do come farther north if you have more salty water. Great point.
The blue crab right out of town, Lloyd, right down by Chippewa Park.
Yeah, sometimes get it here. Yep.
Getting down there, they have nuts down. They easily put nuts down by Bob Chippewa Park. They get blue crab up, they take it back, and they put it up.
Cool. Very cool. Other questions?
Where would you say it starts getting unsalted? Around what point? You mentioned, I think, Hudson when you were talking. Is that the area where we have the least amount or no salt?
So generally, the salt intrusion stops around Beacon. Sometimes comes as far as Poughkeepsie. Not usually any farther than here. So we are a pretty unique area here. We sometimes get the salt water up to here, but mostly have the fresh water. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Yes. And if it is that drought, then we have to rely on a Hudson for our fresh water here.
My understanding, I've lived up here for a number of years. Is my understanding that during times when the water level of the drinking water, the level is extremely low, they pump from the Hudson to New York City from the area of Houstonville.
See, and she's a new ambassador, and this is what I'm telling you. I learn things from my ambassadors all the time.
I make things up as I go.
Yeah.
Is the drinking water of the fountains come from the Hudson River?
Oh, no, that's from New York City, and you don't want to go there, no.
In New York City, let's say that's the water.
Yes.
Has the PCB levels improved in the area?
So I am not extremely familiar with it. I do know that I did watch something more recently that said that it hadn't improved as much as they were hoping. So the DEC does recommend against fishing and eating a lot of fish out of the Hudson River as a result. Yeah.
So, also, we didn't have water way back in the beginning. That's another one.
Yes. Yes.
But the question about the glass eels, do they originate in salt water, or? So
Yeah,
then,
yes.
so then when they get here, they're surviving from the little salt water that we have?
That's actually a good point of why they come up where they do here, because they are glass eels are unusual in the sense that they come from southern to northern to southern, versus salmon are the complete opposite. They do the complete opposite. It's possible that they're able to do that because of the higher concentrations of salt in this water, but I do not know.
Do they go any further than Poughkeepsie?
I do know they're quite prolific in this area, so I would assume that they go farther, but I don't know how much farther. Yeah.
I think we've been told that they go up. I think we've been told that they go up the Fall Kill
They up the Fall Kill.
and possibly other schools.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope that through this presentation you got a little insight onto Mother Nature's memories that you can tap into by understanding the rocks.
Thank you.